Welcome to a deep dive. Today we're taking a stack of sources, articles, research, polls, legal stuff, and really plunging into a topic that gets right to the core of how the U.S. government works.
And importantly, how some people want to change it.
Exactly. We're talking presidential power, checks and balances, that whole system the founders designed, and some, well, pretty ambitious plans out there for potentially reshaping the executive branch.
That's right. And our goal here, for you listening, is to pull out the key insights, the surprising bits, the things you really need to know to get up to speed on these, frankly, critical issues.
Without getting totally buried in all the information, we'll try to connect the dots for you.
We'll do our best. We'll start with that bedrock concept, checks and balances.
Then we'll dive into some really high-stakes recent examples, like the Supreme Court's latest thoughts on presidential immunity.
And then we'll spend a good chunk of time unpacking Project 2025.
Which is this really detailed, comprehensive plan. I mean, it touches everything, doesn't it? Policy goals, how the federal workforce is structured, even how it's funded.
It does. And these sources, taken together, they offer a fascinating look, sometimes a challenging one, at the design of U.S. governance.
How it's been tested through history.
And some very specific proposals for where it might go next.
Okay, let's get into it. So, at the heart of all this is checks and balances. One source calls the system, the founders created an elaborate, clunky machine. Clunky, I like that.
Yeah, clunky because it's meant to have friction, right? It deliberately splits power. You've got three distinct branches, theoretically co-equal.
And you have to remember the founders' mindset here. They were incredibly wary of concentrated authority.
Deeply distrustful of it,
Yeah.
So they built this system, and interestingly, one source points out it doesn't necessarily assume everyone's an angel.
Oh, no kidding.
But it does seem to rely on people operating in good faith, or at least maybe not pushing their power absolutely to the max all the time.
And this tension, this kind of push and pull between the branches, it's not new at all, is it?
Not even close. The sources walk through some great historical examples.
Right, like go way back. President John Adams, end of his term, makes all these judicial appointments, the midnight appointments.
Yep. And then what happens? The next guys, Jefferson and Madison, they just ignore them.
Just ignore them. That's a check right there. Or maybe a refusal to be checked, depending how you look at it.
Right. And you see it with big economic policy, too. Those clashes over national banks.
Yeah.
Hamilton, Washington, Jackson, Congress, back and forth.
Jackson eventually vetoed the bank recharter, and Congress couldn't override him. Power asserted, power checked. Simple as that sometimes.
Then there's the whole issue of government jobs. It used to be the spoil system, right? Presidents rewarding buddies.
Yeah, pure patronage.
But Congress pushed back. The Pendleton Act, 1883, created a merit-based civil service.
And now, fast forward, and the sources point out that very system is being challenged again by proposals like reviving something called Schedule F.
Ah, yes, Schedule F. For anyone not deep in the civil service weeds, that's a proposed reclassification.
It would basically make it much easier to fire potentially tens of thousands of federal employees, wouldn't it? Those career folks who usually have protection.
Exactly. It's seen as a way to swap out career staff for political appointees much more easily. A return to something more like patronage, critics would say.
We also saw the Senate check President Wilson pretty hard on his big foreign policy dream.
The League of Nations.
Yeah, the Senate just refused to ratify the treaty back in 1919, blocked U.S. entry.
And later, you had FDR. The Supreme Court struck down some New Deal laws.
So he comes up with this court packing scheme, suggests adding more justices.
But even his own party in Congress was like, no. They didn't really even consider it seriously. That's Congress checking a president who was trying to check the courts.
Let's think checks on check.
Pretty much. And speaking of FDR, he served 4 terms, breaking that old 2-term tradition.
So what happened? Soon after he died, Congress pushed through the 22nd Amendment.
Right. Limiting presidents to 2 terms. Baked right into the Constitution. Another check.
And you can't talk checks and balances without mentioning Watergate.
Oh, absolutely. The classic case, it really showed multiple checks working, even under, immense pressure.
The press was huge there. The fourth estate, as they say.
Yeah, one source cites Edmund Burke on that. The press holding power accountable from McCarthy back in the 50s through Watergate, even later NSA surveillance stuff.
And during Watergate itself, Congress moved towards impeachment.
And the Supreme Court stepped in decisively, ruled against Nixon on executive privilege, made him hand over the tapes, a critical check.
Congress has also used its power of the purse, right?
Yeah.
Cutting funding as a check.
Yeah, definitely. Like during the Vietnam era, they used funding cuts to influence military and foreign policy.
So, okay, we have this whole history. Push and pull.
Yep.
Power asserted, power checked. How does this help us understand today?
Well, the sources argue this clunky machine is being tested right now.
How so?
They point to things like the heavy use of executive orders by recent presidents, and also, as one source puts it, the denigrating judges.
You mean like public criticism, undermining the judiciary from the executive branch?
Exactly. Which raises the question, where does the public stand on all this?
Good question. Did the sources have polling?
Yes, an Elon University poll from April 2025. And it found something pretty striking. A big majority, 67% of Americans, are actually concerned about a potential constitutional crisis.
A crisis where, what? The executive and courts just hit a wall and neither backs down.
That's the scenario they're worried about. And that same poll showed just how divided people are on specific issues.
Like what?
Like President Trump's executive orders. 47% said they went too far. But, interestingly, the exact same number, 47%, thought the judges who blocked them were correct. A perfect split.
Wow. And what about the idea of the president ignoring courts?
Well, a clear majority, 54%, said the executive branch should not have the power to ignore court rulings.
Okay, so most people believe in respecting the courts.
Yes, but here's a key finding. 40% of Republicans polled actually believe the president should have that power to ignore rulings. That's a pretty significant difference in perspective on the balance of power.
Yeah, it is. And that, I guess, leads us right into one of the hottest legal debates. Presidential immunity.
The big one. We have the Supreme Court's opinion from July 1st, 2024, Trump v. United States.
What was the main takeaway there?
The court really focused on trying to draw a line between a president's official actions while in office and their unofficial or private actions.
Okay, official versus private. And immunity applies to
Official acts, actions within the outer perimeter of official duties as long as they weren't manifestly or palpably beyond authority. That's the court's language.
That sounds potentially tricky to apply in practice. Did the court acknowledge that?
They did. They explicitly said the sheer breadth of presidential responsibilities makes it hard to draw that line. They suggested an objective analysis looking at content, form, and context is needed, but yeah, they admitted it's challenging.
So did they definitively say immunity is absolute for official acts or just presumed?
Crucially, they punted on that, basically. They said they were not making a final ruling on whether immunity is presumptive or absolute at this point.
Why not?
Their reasoning was that having only one case like this in over 2 centuries just wasn't enough experience or precedent to make such a sweeping definitive rule yet.
Interesting. Were there differing opinions among the justices?
Oh, absolutely. You saw different philosophies.
Yeah.
Justice Thomas, concurring, went back to the founders. He highlighted how Congress creates offices established by law, unlike, say, the British monarch's power.
And how did he apply that?
He suggested assessing charges based on whether the law was even meant to apply to a president's official actions. He talked about a potential public authority exception.
Okay. And on the other side, any strong dissents?
Justice Sotomayor wrote a very forceful dissent. She argued the decision effectively reshapes the institution of the presidency.
Strong words.
Yeah, she said it makes a mockery of the principle that nobody is above the law. She saw a far greater danger in a president feeling empowered to break criminal law without fear.
Did she give any examples?
She did, a very vivid one. She questioned basing the official distinction just on the character of the president's responsibilities. She said, look, a president can fire an attorney general. That's an official power.
Right.
But she argued that power surely doesn't extend to, say, poisoning him to death. That act wouldn't suddenly become official just because the president has removal power.
Wow. Okay, that definitely makes the point clear. How does the public feel about this specific immunity question?
Back to the Elon poll. 46% of Americans oppose presidential immunity for official acts, while only 31% support it. So more opposition than support there.
And did the poll touch on other related powers?
Yeah, briefly, 42% think presidents should have pardoning power for federal crimes. And other sources we looked at mentioned ongoing oversight concerns from the past, things like security clearances, Russia ties, ethics rules, handling national security info.
Stuff that could easily come up again, depending on how executive power is used, right?
Exactly. Areas to watch.
Okay. So we've covered the historical system, the current tests, the legal fights over power. Let's pivot now to this very concrete plan we mentioned, Project 2025.
Right. This is a huge collaborative effort, led by the Heritage Foundation, but involving dozens and dozens of conservative groups.
And its stated goal, according to one source, is pretty blunt: institutionalizing Trumpism.
That's the phrase used. And the core idea behind it seems to be a massive effort to dismantle what they call the administrative state.
Meaning the bureaucracy, career civil servants, independent agencies.
Pretty much all of that. The goal is to centralize power directly under the president.
How does that connect to theories of presidential power?
It's rooted in something called unitary executive theory, which is the idea basically that the president has total, absolute control over the entire executive branch. No ifs, ands, or buts.
And sources describe that theory as
Controversial. They highlight worries that it could be used to justify getting rid of agency independence entirely, even for places like the Justice Department.
so total control. Kevin Roberts from Heritage is quoted saying, all federal employees should answer to the president.
That sums up the view. And a huge part of making that happen is personnel.
Right. The plan to potentially fire tens of thousands of government workers, up to 50,000, the sources say.
And replace them with loyalists, people aligned with the project's goals. This is where that Schedule F classification comes back in. It's the tool they plan to use.
So it really brings back those old fears about a spoils system replacing the merit system we talked about earlier.
That's exactly the concern critics raise. They argue that while maybe the civil service needs reform, this specific approach looks more like a power grab than good governance.
And what's the underlying philosophy driving this?
It's very clearly grounded in conservative and, sources say, Christian nationalist principles. The main document, the Mandate for Leadership.
That's the big book, right? The blueprint.
Yeah, nearly 1,000 pages. It explicitly aims, in its own words, to infuse every aspect of federal government with Christian nationalism.
Wow. How does that translate into policy?
There's a very strong emphasis on the family, specifically what they call a biblically based, social science reinforced definition of marriage and family. They see that as central.
And Kevin Roberts connects this to solving societal problems.
Yes, in the foreword, he links it to tackling things like inflation, drug deaths, and what he calls the toxic normalization of transgenderism.
Okay, let's get specific. What policy areas does Project 2025 target for big changes? Environment and climate seem like a major one.
Absolutely. The authors involved often promote climate change denial, or at least skepticism. The plan calls for aggressively rolling back environmental regulations.
And stopping states from having stricter rules than the feds.
Right. Plus, mandatory expansion of fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, opening up the Arctic for drilling, removing climate change from the National Security Council's agenda.
What about things like the Inflation Reduction Act?
Repeal it, and close the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office, which funds a lot of clean energy stuff.
Okay, so a complete reversal on climate policy. What about immigration?
Very significant changes proposed there, too, and quite controversial. The mandate itself mentions potentially using the military for domestic law enforcement, including immigration under the Insurrection Act.
Using the military on U.S. soil for immigration? That's intense.
It is. Heritage has apparently denied that's their specific intent, but the language is in the document. And then you have ideas floated by people like Stephen Miller.
Formerly in the Trump administration.
Right. Ideas like deputizing all sorts of forces, National Guard, local police, even ATF and DEA agents to conduct mass arrests of immigrants nationwide.
Mass arrests. Where would people be held?
The sources mention the potential use of internment camps and even ideas about rounding up homeless people in cities run by Democrats.
Wow. Okay. What about identity issues, social policy?
A very strong stance against what the project calls radical gender ideology. It seeks to remove federal discrimination protections based on sexual orientation or gender identity.
And DEI initiatives. Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Dismantle them across the government. They call DEI state-sanctioned racism. Federal employees involved in DEI or teaching critical race theory could be fired.
Let's talk law enforcement and justice. You mentioned the DOJ earlier.
Yeah, the plan aims to make the Justice Department less independent, which critics fear could open the door to prosecuting political opponents.
What else? Police reform.
It calls for limiting the use of consent decrees, which are those agreements the DOJ uses to force reforms on local police departments.
Death penalty.
Expand it to crimes like pedophilia, even though sources note that directly contradicts a Supreme Court ruling.
Anything else unusual in law enforcement?
One proposal suggests letting the Secret Service Uniform Division enforce laws more broadly in D.C., outside their usual White House duties.
Interesting. And how does this square with public opinion? We talked about that poll earlier.
Right. The Elon poll found 69% of Americans, including most Republicans, think the president should not influence DOJ cases. So there seems to be a disconnect there.
Okay, national security. The military, what's the focus?
Big focus on countering China and a lot of criticism of current military policies.
What kind of policies?
Things related to diversity, climate change considerations. The plan calls for abolishing DEI in the military, reinstating unvaccinated service members, and removing climate change from threat assessment.
And weapon systems.
A major proposal for a dramatic buildup of nuclear weapons, described as the biggest since Reagan. Developing new systems, maybe pulling out of treaties, definitely increasing funding for nukes.
Okay. Another area mentioned in the sources is pornography. What's the plan there?
They argue it's not protected speech under the First Amendment.
So ban it?
Yes, ban it and criminally prosecute producers. They even compare it to addictive drugs.
Well, that's a strong stance. What about women's reproductive health?
This is another huge focus, generally seeking to restrict access significantly.
How specifically?
Things like cutting Title X family planning funds, making clinics emphasize marriage, pushing the FDA to reverse approval of abortion pills like mifepristone.
What about insurance coverage?
Aiming to eliminate coverage for emergency contraception like the morning after pill, Ella, under the Affordable Care Act.
And you mentioned abortion pills. Is there more on that?
Yes, and this is really significant, according to sources. The plan involves reviving and strictly enforcing the Comstock Act.
Yeah, that's an old law, right? 19th century.
Exactly, an old anti-obscenity law. But the idea is to reinterpret it and use it to ban sending abortion pills and medical equipment used for abortions through the mail.
Which would
effectively create a de facto national abortion ban, critics argue, because it would make it incredibly hard and potentially criminal to provide or receive the necessary means for many abortions, even in states where it's legal.
Wow, that's a major potential impact using an old law. Anything else on reproductive health?
Removing the Department of Health and Human Services from sex education rules, promoting fertility awareness methods instead.
Got it. Any other interesting policy nuggets from the sources?
Yeah, a couple more. One proposal at the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, to actually raise campaign contribution limits.
Raise them. What's the reasoning?
The author argues against the usual anti-corruption rationale. Critics quoted called that view absurd, especially with super PACs already spending so much.
Okay. And something about the census.
A proposal critics worry is designed to undercount people in areas with lots of non-citizens or minorities, which of course affects political representation and how federal funds are distributed.
And again, these plans often touch on areas where there was controversy before, right?
Mm-hmm.
Security clearances, ethics.
Exactly. Things that were flashpoints in the Trump administration could definitely be targets for change or areas of continued focus under a plan like this.
So Project 2025 isn't just policy ideas, it's operational too, right? Especially the staffing part.
Hugely operational. They're building a massive personnel database, potential hires.
And they're vetted.
Oh, yeah. Sources say applicants have to respond to ideological questions. Their social media gets scrutinized. People like John McEntee, who worked in personnel in the Trump White House, are involved.
Yeah, there's training involved.
Yes. Training modules designed to prepare, as one source put it, aligned, trained, and essentially weaponized conservatives ready to do battle against the deep state.
Weaponized conservatives. Strong language again. It's a very deliberate effort to get the right people in place.
Personnel is policy, right? That's the mantra.
And who's paying for all this? It sounds like a massive undertaking.
It is. Funding comes from a network of conservative organizations and foundations. The sources mention names like the Scaife Family Foundations.
Any others?
The Coors family is highlighted too. The Adolph Coors Foundation has given millions to Project 2025 groups and related institutions.
And Leonard Leo. He's often mentioned in conservative funding circles.
Yes, his Marble Freedom Trust got that enormous $1.65 billion donation a few years back. And sources trace money from there. $100 million went to the Concord Fund, which then gave over $22 million to Project 2025 groups, including almost $12 million just to Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America.
So significant funding flows. Now, the connection to Donald Trump, his campaign says, hey, only we speak for the candidate. Agenda 47 is our plan.
They do say that, but the sources push back a bit. They note how many people involved in Project 2025 are former Trump officials. high-level ones.
And Heritage Foundation leading it is obviously closely aligned. Roberts saying their role is institutionalizing Trumpism.
Right, and the whole project reportedly started partly because Trump felt he had terrible staff the first time around and needed a better system to find loyalists.
J.D. Vance wrote a foreword for Roberts' book too, didn't he? Another connection.
He did. So sources say commentators are pretty skeptical when Trump denies knowing about Project 2025's details.
Why skeptical?
Because the goals align so closely with his own rhetoric and policies, and because so many of his former aides are running it. Plus, some recent actions and statements seem to mirror Project 2025 proposals already.
Okay, finally, what are the main criticisms? How are people reacting?
Well, the big one is the charge of authoritarianism. Critics argue the whole point is to let president function as a dictator by gutting checks and balances.
That's a serious accusation.
It is. There are also widespread concerns about increased corruption, about government just not working anymore if you prioritize loyalty over actual expertise.
Undermining basic functionality.
Exactly. And it all comes back to that intense focus on personnel. The idea that if you get the right people in, you can push through almost any policy change.
So the debate isn't just about policy A versus policy B.
No, the sources make it clear. It's about a proposed fundamental reshaping of the executive branch itself. Its power, its structure, its relationship to everyone else.
And there you have it. We've really taken a deep dive today, haven't we? Into this complex dance between presidential power, that enduring, sometimes clunky, system of checks and balances.
And these incredibly detailed blueprints like Project 2025 that want to significantly redraw the lines of the executive branch.
Our sources helped us see the history here, the roots of these tensions in American government.
And how they're playing out right now. In court cases about immunity, in public worries about a constitutional crisis. Very real, very high-stakes stuff.
And the sheer scale of Project 2025. I mean, touching everything from climate rules and immigration to how the civil service works to reproductive health, it really shows the level of change being actively planned.
Hopefully this deep dive pulled out those key insights, those important details from all the material we looked at, gave you that shortcut to getting informed on these complex, connected issues.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with. As these detailed plans for restructuring government, for redefining presidential power, gain more traction, what's the ultimate long-term impact? On that balance the founders tried to create, and how might the future reshape that core relationship between the president, the other institutions, and, well, the American public?